things to, I think, different people. So I'm going to define it for what it has meant for us. So I guess the first question is, why a growth team? For me, it came at the end of 2014. We were coming off another great year. We had more than doubled the business again. And I was starting to look towards 2015 and saying, how do we do this again next year? And our historical approach was basically, if we wanted to grow, let's say 100%, then we needed to grow top of funnel 100%. And over time, I think that starts to get a little bit more challenging with scale. And so I started looking at the rest of the funnel, right? Yes, let's get more visitors, but once they visit the site, let's turn them more effectively into users, and ideally then get those users to actually subscribe from the freemium model. And so in a very non-scientific way, right, here's an example. Well, yes, let's still grow 50% top of funnel, but get some compounding effects later once they actually sign up, start using the product. What can we do there to actually get them to subscription and end up with the same kind of growth rates as we've had in previous years, even if we don't grow necessarily quite as fast top of funnel. And so since we wanted to focus here, we knew that it would require a dedicated growth team to achieve those kind of improvements, lower in the funnel. So wanted to talk a little bit about there. So some growth teams, are focused on top of funnel. We have primarily focused on kind of lower in the funnel. Now, we have learned that just putting together a growth team doesn't guarantee success. We tried this in 2013. We put together a small team. We said, we've had success running experiments in the past. Let's turn this up a little bit. Unfortunately, that attempt kind of fizzled after a few months. And we walked away from it without a lot of clear wins. If we contrast that to what we started at the beginning of 2015, that has now gone on for about 18 months. It's a core part of the business. It's been a driving lever in our growth over that time. And so obviously the question then is, what's been the difference? And so that's what I want to quickly talk about, 7 quick lessons that we've learned, comparing and contrasting the two attempts at this, as well as just a few other things. So first, I can't stress enough that you have to actually dedicate resources to this. So when we went and did this in 2013, basically the team consisted of 10% of my time as chief revenue officer at the time, maybe 20% of our director of product. We had 1 full-time engineer and then 2 part-time engineering resources. Again, if you contrast that to what we did with 2015, we have a specific director of growth dedicated 100% of his time. He lives, breathes, sleeps this. A more junior analyst, again, 100% of his time, and 3 full-time engineers. And you'll see later why this is so important to actually have people dedicated to this. But I'm a big believer that people can only focus on so much and do that well. In addition, what often happens is if you aren't willing to actually dedicate the resources, those engineering resources are precious, right? And they say, well, we're going to put them on this project for just the next sprint, but then they'll go back to the growth team. And that was one of the problems we ran into here. And so I'd say, if you're not actually ready to dedicate the resources and to sort of truly make them, a little bit sacred and non-touchable, then don't do a growth team. On the team perspective, so putting together the right team, our director of growth, I see a lot of job descriptions, and they don't match our director of growth. And so this is probably different for every organization, but our director of growth had no previous growth experience, no previous marketing experience. But what he did bring, and maybe this is unique to our organization, but I don't think so, he's incredibly smart, so we knew he'd be able to figure out problems. He did have a deep background in analytics, and probably the most analytical person at our company. And he was driven by results. I mean, you put a goal in front of him, and he's going to run through walls to get there. And I think that's the kind of person you need in this. The other part of the equation, though, is equally as important on the engineering side. I've worked at Lucid for the last 5.5 years, worked with some brilliant engineers. And just like most of us, they want to work on things they find interesting. And not all engineers, in fact, I think most engineers, at least that I've worked with, would rather be working on sort of the latest and greatest technical achievement than perhaps focusing on items related to the core business. And so we had to find an engineering team lead who was not only incredibly brilliant, he was one of our top engineers, but he actually had a passion about the business, about understanding the psychology of users. Because then the magic starts to happen. One without the other, I don't think is very powerful, but when the engineers start to engage, they start asking the right questions, they start pushing for better ideas, better solutions than any director of growth, I think, is going to come up with on their own. So I think the first key lesson is you've got to put together the right team and have the right people on it. Next is you've got to set a clear objective and goal. This seems obvious for all of us who've been in business for a while, but I've talked to enough growth teams that it often happens like ours originally did, where we said, we've had some success, let's put together a team to run some experiments. And so we didn't actually have any clear sort of objective. In 2015, we made it very clear. The rest of our product and engineering organization was essentially focused on usage, activity rates, engagement. And so we said the growth team in this case is going to be focused on revenue generating experiments. And they're responsible for driving X number of $1 million in incremental revenue this year. So very clear. Because otherwise you end up with us, like we did in 2013, and a lot of growth teams where we're going to run some cool experiments. And you'll probably be disappointed by that. Next, I'd say take that goal and actually put it against a few criteria. One is the opportunity cost. If you aren't 100% confident that you have product market fit, I wouldn't invest in a growth team. Invest in your core product and make sure you've nailed it first. Because those resources are too precious to be dedicating somewhere else if you haven't really nailed it at the core. Second, I'd say, in our case, we were dedicating 5, fully loaded salaries, some tools to this, and so on. And so I think the typical kind of SaaS metrics should apply. In our case, I was talking about just a minute ago, when we do paid advertising, right? We want cash payback in a year or less. Same kind of thing where we will aim for investments where we'll get 5x customer lifetime value to the customer acquisition cost. And I think the same should apply to any growth team, right? Take their goal and put it, and their results eventually, and put it against the investment and say, are we seeing the same type of results we would expect, from any other paid investment? And finally, consider, does that goal that they have and the objective motivate not just the core team, but also the organization? We'll talk about it in a minute, but the organization likely at times is going to have to make some hard choices, some trade-offs, and potentially consider doing some things inside or outside the product that make you a little bit uncomfortable, not because they're bad, but because they're different than what the organization has done for potentially years. And so there has to be sort of organizational alignment around this goal and belief that this is core to the business. So you've got the right team, you've got a clear goal. The first place I would recommend investing is your data infrastructure. In 2013, we were primarily relying on our internal homegrown system. Some of you have probably been in the same place as this. And we ran a number of great experiments, we thought. For example, part of that homegrown system would be the way that users were randomly put in the A version of the arm, or the A arm, or the B arm of the experiment. After months of experiments, one of our brightest engineers looked deeply at the code when we were having some unclear or results that didn't make sense for one of our experiments. And he said, by the way, I hate to tell you this, Dave, but it turns out that if you're running one experiment at a time, it's great. But if you're running 2, 3, 4, 5 experiments, we have a problem because the same users are always going to be put in A, and the same users are always going to be put in B. right? And so months of our experiments were skewed. We couldn't trust the results. We had other issues with our internal analytics system over the years. For a while, we did not invest in AdWords, for example, because when we ran tests, our internal attribution system, we'd look at it and we'd say, well, this doesn't appear to be profitable. Again, turns out that there were some flaws with our internal analytics and the attribution. And in fact, when we actually put in a third-party system, voila, it was a tremendous channel for us. So long story short, in 2015, we invested pretty heavily at the beginning of this, and actually had done some in the beginning, but really shorted up at this point, where we invested in a third-party system. For us, it was Kissmetrics. I think there's lots of great ones, on the market, but you got to make sure you have confidence in the data, because we wasted kind of months on doing that. So I'm a big believer that unless you're a data analytics company, buy, don't build. Some of the greatest engineers want to build, but I would encourage you to invest in actually buying. So you've got, hopefully, the right team, clear goal, data you can trust. And once you announce a growth team internally, you'll find a couple of things happen. One is you start getting a lot of emails, people forwarding with subject lines like this, great blog articles, 19 tests you should run, 13 tests you should run, 81 tests we ran in 30 minutes. And these can be a good source of ideas. The other thing that will happen, which again is a good thing, is hopefully ideas will start coming out of the woodwork in an organization, right? You'll start to hear things from the support team. You'll start to hear ideas from the sales team, from the marketing team, and other places in the organization. Again, good sources for ideas. But one thing I'd encourage you to do is think about data not just as how you're going to analyze the end results, but actually, for the genesis of ideas. So let me give you an example. So we ran an analysis of our 14-day trial. We had had a 14-day trial for as long as we had been in existence. But what we found when we actually ran the analysis was that, like most of our products, like most freemium products, usage declined kind of day over day, right? A lot of users are going to sign up, they're going to kick the tires the first day, but they're probably, some of them are not going to come back on day 2. Some of those users are, day 2 aren't going to come back, day 3, and so on, right? This is something I think we all experience and think hard about onboarding and so on, but I think it's just kind of a matter of fact that we have to deal with. What we realized is that 30% more users were still active on day 7 than day 14 of the trial. And yet, 80% of the total trial activity, right? So how many diagrams they were creating, sharing, and so on, was also done by day 7, right? So we developed a hypothesis based on the analysis that said, well, why don't we shorten the trial from 14 to 7 days? And by doing that, we allow users to hopefully experience a product, still extract a lot of value, but hopefully catch more of them for the decision to subscribe or not. This graph shows kind of the two arms of the test, with the red being the 7-day trial and the x-axis being the day since registration, and that's the conversion rate. And so following the data in this case, including for the genesis of the idea, yielded one of our biggest results in 2015, right? We increased, conversion rates by 20% or so across all of our trials. So source ideas from everywhere, but rely on data as well and analysis to drive it. That was one of the main differences when you go back to the team, is when I was dedicating 10% of my time, or my director of product 20% of his time, we were so busy that essentially the genesis of ideas went something like this. We'd say, hey, we want to focus on sharing. Let's all get into a room, brainstorm our best ideas, and then we're going to go prioritize them. And we didn't do sort of any analysis beforehand to say, what opportunities might there be? Where are the clear fall-offs in the funnel and so on, right? And so the ideas from your gut are good, but they may not be as what you'll get if you actually run some analysis. the next lesson in this for us is that you've got to create the kind of culture where you're willing to go after big bets, and not just the incremental kind of things, right? Where you're testing colors of buttons or just a copy, at the top of the page. Our team in the last 18 months, we've tested pricing, paywalls, onboarding flows. There's one going out soon requiring a credit card for trial, right? These are sort of major differences in our business model that for the most part have been relatively stagnant for the last 4 or 5 years. And our success rate is not off the charts, right? 3 out of 10 experiments maybe for us are successful. But that's generally because we're testing big things, and when they are successful, they're big wins. The other thing is, I know this from our marketing team and talking to lots of other growth teams, is again, you come up with those ideas from the gut, and you may not run the analysis to say, if this was successful, right? If we actually increase this by 30%, right? Massive win, how much would it be worth to the business? I've been a part of experiments where we scope it, we build it, we launch it, and then we realize that it's going to take 6 months to get to statistical significance because only 100 people go through that flow every week. And even if we did move that metric for those 100 people, it'd be worth like $1,000 to the business. So even though it was really interesting, it wasn't something worth chasing. But we've made that mistake. So for me, if some of the ideas, at least some of them, don't make you somewhat uncomfortable, right? If they're not really challenging the status quo, if you're not excited, literally, sometimes I would be refreshing KISS metrics multiple times a day to see what the latest results were, right? If those aren't the ideas that you're testing, you might be playing it too safe. Okay, so we've got the right things in place. We've got ideas generating from our data, hopefully big things that we're testing. The last couple lessons here about how do we evaluate whether we've actually had success. Here's an example, right? After 30 days, B is producing more subscriptions with 95% significance. Seems like a pretty clear win. Let's call it 100%, and off we go. And the answer is maybe, right? This is kind of what we did in 2013. We looked at things at a pretty high level and didn't necessarily dig in to ask seemingly obvious questions, right? What levels did the customer subscribe at? How much were they on average worth? Were they monthly or annual contracts? Are there any early indicators of how these users are going to react in the long term? So these seem obvious. One of the things that I don't think seems as obvious, but I would stress a lot for SaaS companies, because this has made a big difference for us in how we've called a lot of experiments, is that sometimes it's easy to look at like the short-term revenue impact, but not necessarily look at customer lifetime value. So for us, we have multiple levels, right? We have basic, pro, team, enterprise. We have monthly and annual contracts. And I don't know how it is for your business, but generally if someone chooses annual for us, they tend to be much stickier and they'll stay around a number of years, while monthly contract, maybe only a year or two. And so it makes a big difference in customer lifetime value. And so there can be the risk of saying we increase subscriptions 30%, but often we have to ask, how did it change the mix, not just of levels, but monthly and annual, because that annual customer may be worth 4x when it comes from a customer lifetime value perspective. Yeah.
How do you do that on a short-term gain, looking at LTV? That's one of the things that we struggle with as well, looking at that LTV. Like, are there certain indicators that you look at outside of the yearly contract to diagnose and say, yeah, lifetime value should increase? Obviously, that's a huge leap forward.
Yeah, it's a lot of guessing still. And so in this case, we're primarily relying on the historical customer lifetime values, right? We know that a basic annual is worth so much. And so just evaluating the new mix based on, the results of the test. It's a good question. Okay. And finally, and this is related to this question, is you have to be careful of long tail effects, particularly in our kind of business, right? And what I mean by that is, for example, we have certain paywalls on our free plan. There have been times when we have put in a more restrictive paywall. Not surprisingly, subscriptions went up. But what also happened, and it took a little while for this to become clear, is that more users hit the paywall. More of them paid, but more of them abandoned the product as well, right? So in the near term, there was this uptick in subscriptions, but like most freemium products, we also have this long tail, where people stick around and use the free product for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months before they subscribe. And we had sort of chopped off that long tail, right? But that didn't become clear for a while. And so at this point, we've learned on every one of our wins to run the same analysis 90 days, 180 days later, looking at the original cohorts and saying, how did they act in the long term? And again, for the vast majority of these, the results have stayed pretty consistent. But we've had a couple that have flipped in the long term and actually had a pretty big impact on our business. I think putting together a growth team can be a phenomenal, growth lever from a revenue basis. For us, it certainly has been. 2015 was another great year, and we were able to more than double again, in large part to kind of those lower funnel conversion optimizations from our growth team. So hopefully these tips are helpful, and happy to talk more specifics with anyone afterwards.